to deliver a speech on the crisis in Ukraine. Now, the White House says the president will call on the West and its allies to stand against Vladimir Putin. Ahead of his address, Biden met with Ukrainian refugees outside a Warsaw football stadium, where the U.S. president called Putin a butcher. Earlier, Biden held talks with his Polish counterpart, Andrzej Duda. The two discussed the situation in Ukraine and the West's military, humanitarian, and economic response to the war. And I'm joined now in the studio by William Glucroft, who's going to help break this down for us. William, hi. This visit by Biden and his meeting with Duda is going to be an interesting one to watch, what comes out of this speech. We know it's no secret that the Polish president and the U.S. president haven't always seen eye to eye.
That's right. Biden has kind of staked his presidency on this idea of democracy versus authoritarianism. And Poland these days, and for the last many years, is kind of somewhere in between, a democratic country with a very highly conservative government that seemed more aligned with Trump's view of the world back when Donald Trump was president. Duda is one of many officials there who took a while to ring up Joe Biden and congratulate him on becoming president in 2020. So there is some bad blood, you could say, there. Duda was also the one who came up with the whole Fort Trump idea.
That's right. And I just want to tell our viewers, we are looking at live images of what appears to be the U.S. motorcade with American flags arriving here. Now, William, can you tell us a little bit more? You hinted that in many ways Duda was more aligned with the Trump administration. In what sense do you mean that?
Well, we see things about, restrictions on abortion in Poland, LGBTQ plus rights, how difficult it is for those people there. And then restricting the judiciary in Poland has been the big sticking point, especially here in the European Union. Poland is a member of the EU. It gets a lot of funds from the EU to support infrastructure and these kinds of things. The EU has been holding back a lot of otherwise earmarked support for Poland as retribution, as punishment, as consequence for not sticking to EU rules on rule of law, transparency, democratic values. And these are all things that the U.S. president also says he stands for. And he's in the past, highlighted Poland as one country of several that seems to be backsliding into authoritarianism. But at the same time, standing up to Russia right now, Poland has always been very, very hard on Russia, harder than many other parts of the EU, like Germany. So you see this very much a tale of two countries, a golden child and a black sheep, so to speak, when it comes to the Western alliance.
Right. Now, what's been interesting also about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that we have seen such a strong show of unity among Western allies that has even taken some by surprise, how strongly they have come together. And it has required some huge shifts in policy. That's been quite apparent here in Germany, perhaps most of all.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because of Brexit, because of Donald Trump's treatment of his allies, particularly here in Europe, there has been a lot of disunity among the traditional Western alliance over the last 5-10 years, let's say, trying to figure out what exactly their position is vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, terrorism, climate change, these kinds of major issues. And there's not been a lot of unity on that front. And what's the best way to get unity than to have a common enemy, a common cause? And we're seeing that absolutely, as you say, right here in Germany with this sudden, huge about face after years of running from hard power, running from military power, now running from the modernizing, investing in their armed forces, leaving that to others. You have a country that's about to put 100 billion euros on top of its already existing spending for a one-off topping up of defense expenditures. And going forward, it's looking like, larger military budgets from here on out. Could be a challenge. They want to get that into the Constitution to make that constitutional protection, to make sure that those budgets are always there for the military. So there's a long legislative process still left to go. But Germany is a country currently led by three parties. Two of them believe themselves to be anti-war, pro-peace, disarmament parties, anti-nuclear parties. The third one, the Free Democrats, they're the ones who are low-tax, low spending. So we're seeing a complete shift in ideology here in Germany based on events that have unfolded in the last several weeks.
And I just want to draw our viewers' attention back to the live images that we are seeing here. We are waiting for Joe Biden to make a major speech in Warsaw. We expect him to call for the West and its allies to stand up against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're going to be bringing live coverage of that speech once it begins. It appears the motorcade is just on its way in. With me in the studio here is William Glucroft with analysis. William, I want to ask you we've just spoken about the unity among the EU and among NATO partners, but what are some of the fundamental differences within the EU when it comes to their response to Russia?
Yeah, there's a calibration issue, right? Within the EU itself, there's differing opinions about how hard to go on sanctions, how hard to go on energy embargoes, how hard to go on the kind of military support for Ukraine. You have countries like Poland and the Baltic states who have a bad history with Russia and have been warning the rest of the European Union for years, watch out for this. This is not just our post-communist trauma or post-communist paranoia. They've been warning about Russia for a long, long time. Wanting harder sanctions, wanting more military presence, wanting NATO to do more. We saw that Poland's offer of its MiG-29 jets that the U.S., no pun intended, shot down. And you're seeing, from the U.S. side, very hard sanctions, increasing sanctions, the oil gas embargo, which the EU especially is not there yet. We've been hearing about it a lot. It's worth repeating. The European Union is incredibly dependent on Russia for its energy. Something like 40% of European Union's gas comes from Russia, whereas the United States is something like 3%. The U.S. is also, of course, its own major exporter and producer of natural gas. Very much what the EU is going through now with its dependency on Russia and the geopolitical problems it's causing. The U.S. faced 25 years ago after 9/11 this dependency on Arab oil and how it was fueling extremism and fueling instability in the Middle East. We're seeing now how petro-euros going to Russia is fueling instability here in Europe. And the U.S. did, by and large, get off or lower its dependence on Arab oil and gas. Now the question is, can the European Union do the same thing with Russia?
Right, so Biden and the EU finding themselves in totally different situations in that sense.
Absolutely, and Russia is right here, of course, whereas the U.S. is much more geographically isolated from that fact.
But within the EU itself, are there differences of opinion on meeting energy needs?
Oh, of course. Again, Poland, the Baltic states, they seem ready to have an energy embargo, even though that would mean massive, massive economic fallout here in the European Union, job losses. We heard this from Olaf Scholz this week. He basically said the pain that sanctions and embargoes would inflict on Russia cannot be less than the pain that would be inflicted on European Union citizens, on German citizens. And that is what they're trying to calibrate. Germany, we heard also this from Robert Habeck, that's the economics and climate minister here in Germany, really the guy responsible for figuring out how to get Germany off of Russian dependency on gas and oil, going to Qatar, going to other countries with oil-producing states, trying to figure out how to offset this. Had a big statement yesterday morning talking about how Germany can gradually get off, for sure, oil and coal from Russia. Much harder to get off the gas because of how many pipelines come from Russia through Ukraine and through the Baltic to provide Germany a highly industrialized, highly energy-intensive economy, and one of the biggest in the world with its energy. This is really the challenge going forward. There's a lot of debate about how much Germans, both politically speaking and in terms of public support among voters, are really willing to feel any pain for the punishment that they're going to inflict on Russia.
So this is clearly the backdrop against which this speech is taking place. We are looking at live pictures, waiting for Biden to arrive. We just saw there an American flag, a Polish flag. The stage is set, waiting for Biden to deliver a speech in Warsaw on the war in Ukraine. Now, William, earlier today, Biden called Putin a butcher. I mean, earlier he's called him terms like war criminal multiple times. But what do you make of this new rhetoric?
It fits with the overall message that he's been sticking to for the last couple of weeks. in no uncertain terms, he sees Vladimir Putin as a war criminal. He even said yesterday, while meeting with humanitarian aid organizations in Poland, looking at the refugee situation, he said he thinks that it would not, it's not just his opinion, but he thinks it would meet the legal standard of what it means to be a war criminal, to be tried in some kind of war criminal court, the International Criminal Court, for example. Biden is talking tough. We're hearing slightly more muted.
William, I just want to jump in and let our viewers know that you're looking there at Andrzej, or you have just seen Andrzej Duda and Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba there awaiting Biden's speech. But please carry on as you were.
So we're seeing again a calibration issue, not only when it comes to sanctions and those kinds of physical actions and penalties, but also a calibration in rhetoric. Not all European leaders are ready to be as strongly worded as Joe Biden, but also Joe Biden has a history of kind of not beating around the bush when it comes to what his thoughts are on certain people or certain policies. So it really does fit with kind of the Biden personality, I think.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that's foreshadowing this speech is Biden has also today cast a doubt on Russia's claims that it is planning to focus only on controlling the eastern Donbass region. What more can you tell us about that?
This is also calibration, right? There's a lot of intelligence and counterintelligence and kind of predicting moves and, you know, a lot of four-dimensional chess going on here between the U.S. And Russian sides. As we saw in the beginning of the war, where the U.S. was announcing definitive knowledge of invasion plans, and how much of it was true, how much of it wasn't, we may never know. I think Biden makes a good point. First of all, we should note that the eastern part of Ukraine has been devastated by the Russian war machine. So to say that they're now going to focus on it is a bit of a it's very difficult to hear that, because it's already been under so much duress and so much bombardment, the East more than the West. And Russia also has a way, Putin has a way of defining what victory means, right? I mean, he probably knows that he's in a bind, that he maybe got in over his head or didn't quite plan this as well as he thought. That's what all the kind of military analysts are saying right now, that he was thinking it was going to be a much easier way to Kyiv and to accomplishing his goals of essentially toppling Zelensky's government. And now he may be looking for a rhetorical way to kind of define victory, consolidate his gains. Where that actually leads, though, of course, is going to be a matter of negotiations and a matter of the next kind of statements to come out of Russia, out of Ukraine, and out of the West in the next few days.
And William, we are still waiting for Biden to begin his speech in Warsaw about the war in Ukraine. Earlier, he said, we understand that he is going to call for what he has called the free world to stand up against Russia's invasion. I mean, he's referring there to Western democratic countries. That is very explicitly Cold War language. What do you make of that?
I mean, Joe Biden is a Cold War president, basically. I mean, this man has known the Cold War. He's He's known for his foreign policy credentials, and those foreign policy credentials were forged in the 4 decades of the Cold War. This is what he knows. I mean, just looking at these pictures here, it has this very kind of JFK and Berlin look to it, right? Warsaw, like Berlin, was also mostly destroyed by the Nazi invasion and just laid in ruins. I mean, everything we're seeing here that looks very old was rebuilt after the war, mostly rebuilt after the war. So there's a lot of similarities here in the kind of address of the free world rhetoric, the liberal order, the democratic order. We've already heard from Biden before this Russian invasion about democracies needing to bind together to confront authoritarianism. In that case, before the war, he was focused more on China. Now we're looking back towards Russia and China. So this is, in a way, not new. It's in a way, it's kind of the next step in this evolution of what Biden is trying to do, which is trying to give Western democracies some new strategy, some new way forward that they've really been suffering from in the last 30, 40 years. You know, since the end of the Cold War, what does America stand for? What does the West stand for? Without an enemy out there to confront, what is its purpose? And I think that's what Biden has been trying to do. Even when he came into office, long before any of this kind of aggression, he was promising a kind of a club of democracies, a conference of democracies to confront not just military aggression and military problems, but also things like climate change.
Now, this very grand scene that you reference is the Warsaw Royal Castle. You see the red carpet has been laid out. The flags are flying. You mentioned, I want to ask you about what this war in Ukraine means for U.S. plans with regard to China, which you just touched on briefly. I mean, for multiple U.S. administrations, there's been talk of pivoting to Asia. They've seemed to be unable to truly focus all of their efforts in that direction. How do you see this affecting that goal?
You know, there's been a lot of speculation and questioning about what is China's position here, because China officially likes to appear neutral. It likes to talk about preserving world order, preserving peace, preserving territorial integrity of all countries. I think we might be...
Joe Biden.
We've just heard an announcement for Joe Biden.
I think I'll be quiet now.
Going to keep an eye.
President of the United States.
Let's cross live
Joe
to these
Biden.
pictures. We are having an announcement that Joe Biden is just arriving, ready to speak on the situation in Ukraine from Warsaw, Poland. Let's listen in.
Joe Biden.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please, have a seat. If you don't, come up on stage. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Mr. President, they tell me you're over there somewhere. There you are. Thank you, Mr. President. Be not afraid. These were the first words at the first... Mr. President, they tell me you're over there somewhere. There you are. Thank you, Mr. President. Be not afraid. These were the first words at the first public address of the first Polish Pope after his election in October of 1978. They were the words that would come to define Pope John Paul II. Words that would change the world. John Paul brought the message here to Warsaw in his first trip back home as Pope in June of 1979. It was a message about the power of faith, the power of resilience, the power of the people. In the face of a cruel and brutal system of government, it was a message that helped end the Soviet repression in the Central Land and Eastern Europe 30 years ago. It was a message that will overcome the cruelty and brutality of this unjust war. When Pope John Paul brought that message in 1979, the Soviet Union ruled with an iron fist behind an iron curtain. Then a year later, the Solidarity movement took hold in Poland. While I know he couldn't be here tonight, we're all grateful in America and around the world for Lech Walesa. Reminds me of that phrase of philosopher Kierkegaard. Faith sees best in the dark. And they were dark moments. 10 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Poland and Central and Eastern Europe would soon be free. Nothing about that battle for freedom was simple or easy. It was a long, painful slog, fought over not days and months, but years and decades. But we emerged anew in the great battle for freedom, a battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. In this battle, we need to be clear-eyed. This battle will not be won in days or months either. We need to steel ourselves for the long fight ahead. Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Mayor, members of the Parliament, distinguished guests, and the people of Poland, and I suspect some people of Ukraine that are here. We are gathered here at the Royal Castle in this city that holds a sacred place in the history of not only of Europe, but humankind's unending search for freedom. For generations, Warsaw has stood where liberty has been challenged and liberty has prevailed. In fact, it was here in Warsaw when a young refugee who fled her home country from Czechoslovakia, was under Soviet domination, came back to speak and stand in solidarity with dissidents. Her name was Madeleine Coble Albright. She became one of the most ardent supporters of democracy in the world. She was a friend with whom I served, America's first woman Secretary of State. She passed away 3 days ago. She fought her whole life for essential democratic principles. And now, in the perennial struggle for democracy and freedom, Ukraine and its people are in the front lines, fighting to save their nation. And their brave resistance is part of a larger fight for an essential democratic principles that unite all free people. The rule of law, fair and free elections, the freedom to speak, to write, and to assemble, the freedom to worship as one chooses, freedom of the press. These principles are essential in a free society. But they have always been under siege. They've always been embattled. Every generation has had to defeat democracy's moral foes. That's the way of the world. For the world is imperfect, as we know, where the appetites and ambitions of a few forever seek to dominate the lives and liberty of many. My message to the people of Ukraine is a message I delivered today to Ukraine's foreign minister and defense minister, who I believe are here tonight. We stand with you, period. Today's fighting Kyiv and Melitopol and Kharkiv are the latest battle in a long struggle. Hungary, 1956. Poland, 1956, and then again, 1981. Czechoslovakia, 1968. Soviet tanks crushed democratic uprisings. But the resistance continued until finally, in 1989, the Berlin Wall and all the walls of Soviet domination, they fell. They fell. And the people prevailed. But the battle for democracy could not conclude and did not conclude with the end of the Cold War. Over the last 30 years, the forces of autocracy have revived all across the globe. Its hallmarks are familiar ones: contempt for the rule of law, contempt for democratic freedom, contempt for the truth itself. Today, Russia has strangled democracy, has sought to do so elsewhere, not only in its homeland. Under false claims of ethnic solidarity, it has invalidated neighboring nations. Putin has the gall to say he's denazifying Ukraine. It's a lie. It's just cynical. He knows that. And it's also obscene. President Zelensky was democratically elected. He's Jewish. His father's family was wiped out in the Nazi Holocaust. And Putin has the audacity, like all our autocrats before him, to believe that might will make right. My own country, a former president named Abraham Lincoln voiced the opposing spirit to save our union in the midst of a civil war. He said, "Let us have faith that right makes might. Right makes might." Today, let us have that faith again. Let us resolve to put the strength of democracies into action to thwart the designs of autocracy. Let us remember that the test of this moment is the test of all time. The Kremlin wants to portray NATO enlargement as an imperial project aimed at destabilizing Russia. Nothing is further from the truth. NATO is a defensive alliance. It has never sought the demise of Russia. In the lead up to the current crisis, the United States and NATO worked for months to engage Russia to avert war. I met with him in person, talked to him many times on the phone. Time and again, we offered real diplomacy and concrete proposals to strengthen European security, enhance transparency, build confidence on all sides. But Putin and Russia met each of the proposals with disinterest in any negotiation, with lies and ultimatums. Russia was bent on violence from the start. I know not all of you believed me and us when we kept saying they are going to cross the border, they are going to attack. Repeatedly, he asserted we had no interest in war, guaranteed he would not move. Repeatedly saying he would not invade Ukraine. Repeatedly saying Russian troops along the border were there for training, all 180,000 of them. There's simply no justification or provocation for Russia's choice of war. It's an example of one of the oldest human impulses, using brute force and disinformation to satisfy a craving for absolute power and control. It's nothing less than a direct challenge to the rule-based international order established since the end of World War II. And it threatens to return to decades of war that ravaged Europe before the international rule-based order was put in place. We cannot go back to that. We cannot. The gravity of the threat is why the response of the West has been so swift and so powerful and so unified, unprecedented and overwhelming. Swift and punishing cost are the only things that are going to get Russia to change its course. Within days of his invasion, the West has moved jointly with sanctions to damage Russia's economy. Russia's central bank is now blocked from global financial system, denying Kremlin's access to the war fund that's stashed around the globe. We've aimed at the heart of Russia's economy by stopping the imports of Russian energy to the United States. To date, the United States has sanctioned 140 Russian oligarchs and their family members, seizing their ill-begotten gains, their yachts, their luxury apartments, their mansions. We've sanctioned more than 400 Russian government officials, including key architects of this war. These officials and oligarchs have reaped enormous benefit from the corruption connected to the Kremlin. And now they have to share in the pain. The private sector is acting as well. Over 400 private multinational companies have pulled out of doing business in Russia, left Russia completely, from oil companies to McDonald's. As a result of these unprecedented sanctions, the ruble almost is immediately reduced to rubble. The Russian economy, that's true, by the way, takes about 200 rubles to equal $1. The economy is on track to be cut in half in the coming years. It was ranked, Russia's economy was ranked the 11th biggest economy in the world before this invasion. It will soon not even rank among the top 20 in the world. Taken together, these economic sanctions are a new kind of economic statecraft with the power to inflict damage that rivals military might. These international sanctions are sapping Russian strength, its ability to replenish its military, and its ability to project power. And it is Putin, it is Vladimir Putin who is to blame, period. At the same time, alongside these economic sanctions, the Western world has come together to provide for the people of Ukraine with incredible levels of military, economic, humanitarian assistance. In the years before the invasion, we, America, had sent over $650 million before they crossed the border in weapons to Ukraine, including anti-air and anti-armor equipment. Since the invasion, America has committed another $1.35 billion in weapons and ammunition. And thanks to the courage and bravery of the Ukrainian people, the equipment we've sent and our colleagues have sent have been used to devastating effect to defend Ukrainian land and airspace. Our allies and partners have stepped up as well. But as I've made clear, American forces are in Europe not in Europe, to engage in conflict with Russian forces. American forces are here to defend NATO allies. Yesterday, I met with the troops that are serving alongside our Polish allies to bolster NATO's frontline defenses. The reason we wanted to make clear is their movement on Ukraine don't even think about moving on 1 single inch of NATO territory. We have sacred obligation. We have a sacred obligation under Article 5 to defend each and every inch of NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. And earlier today, I visited your national stadium where thousands of Ukrainian refugees are now trying to answer the toughest questions a human can ask. My God, what's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? I saw tears in many of the mothers' eyes as I embraced them. They're young children. They're young children, not sure whether to smile or cry. One little girl said, "Mr. President," she spoke a little English, "if my brother and my daddy, are they going to be okay? Will I see them again?" Without their husbands, their fathers. In many cases, their brothers and sisters who stayed back to fight for their country. I didn't have to speak the language or understand the language to feel the emotion in their eyes, where they gripped my hand. Little kids hung onto my leg, praying with a desperate hope that all of this is temporary. Apprehension that they may be perhaps forever away from their homes. Almost a debilitating sadness that this is happening all over again. But I was also struck by the generosity of the people of Warsaw, for that matter, all the Polish people, for the depths of their compassion, their willingness to reach out, for opening their hearts. Say to the mayor and the premier, they're opening their hearts and their homes simply to help. I also want to thank my friend, the great American chef, Jose Andres, and his team for help feeding those who are yearning to be free. But helping these refugees is not something Poland or any other nation should carry alone. All the world democracies have a responsibility to help, all of them. And the people of Ukraine can count on the United States to meet its responsibility. I've announced 2 days ago we will welcome 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. We already have 8,000 a week coming to the United States of other nationalities. We'll provide nearly $300 million in humanitarian assistance, providing tens of thousands of tons of food, water, medicine, and other basic supplies. In Brussels, I announced the United States is prepared to provide more than $1 billion in additional humanitarian aid. The World Food Program told us that despite significant obstacles, at least some relief is getting to major cities in Ukraine, but not not Mariupol, because Russian forces are blocking relief supplies. But we'll not cease our efforts to get humanitarian relief wherever it is needed in Ukraine and for the people who have made it out of Ukraine. Notwithstanding the brutality of Vladimir Putin, let there be no doubt that this war has already been a strategic failure for Russia, already. Having lost children myself, I know that's no solace to the people who've lost family. But he, Putin, thought Ukrainians would roll over and not fight. Not much of a student of history. Instead, Russian forces have met their match with brave and stiff Ukrainian resistance. Rather than breaking Ukrainian resolve, Russia's brutal tactics have strengthened the resolve. Rather than driving NATO apart, the West is now stronger and more united than it has ever been. Russia wanted less of a NATO presence on his border, but now he has a stronger presence, a larger presence, with over 100,000 American troops here, along with all the other members of NATO. In fact, Russia has managed to cause something I'm sure he never intended. The democracies of the world are revitalized with purpose and unity found in months that we'd once taken years to accomplish. It's not only Russia's actions in Ukraine that are reminding us of democracy's blessing. It's our own country, his own country, the Kremlin. It's jailing protesters. 200,000 people have allegedly already left. There's a brain drain leaving Russia, shutting down independent news. State media is all propaganda, blocking the image of civilian targets, mass graves, starvation tactics of the Russian forces in Ukraine. Is there any wonder, as I said, that 200,000 Russians have all left their country in 1 month? A remarkable brain drain in such a short period of time. Which brings me to my message to the Russian people. I've worked with Russian leaders for decades. I sat across the negotiating table going all the way back to Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin to talk arms control at the height of the Cold War. I've always spoken directly and honestly to you, the Russian people. Let me say this if you're able to listen. You, the Russian people, are not our enemy. I refuse to believe that you welcome the killing of innocent children and grandparents, or that you accept hospitals, schools, maternity wards, and for God's sake, being pummeled with Russian missiles and bombs, or cities being surrounded so that civilians cannot flee, supplies cut off, and attempting to starve Ukrainians into submissions. Millions of families are being driven from their homes, including half of all Ukraine's children. These are not the actions of a great nation. Of all people, you, the Russian people, as well as all people across Europe, still have the memory of being in a similar situation in the late 30s and 40s. Situation in World War II, still fresh in the minds of many grandparents in the region. Whatever your generation experienced, whether it experienced the siege of Leningrad or heard about it from your parents and grandparents, train stations overflowing with terrified families fleeing their homes, nights sheltering in basements and cellars, mornings sitting through the rubble in your homes. These are not memories of the past, not anymore, because it's exactly what the Russian army is doing in Ukraine right now. March 26, 2022, just days before we're at the 21st, you were a 21st century nation with hopes and dreams that people all over the world have for themselves and their family. Now, Vladimir Putin's aggression have cut you, the Russian people, off from the rest of the world. And it's taking Russia back to the 19th century. This is not who you are. This is not the future you deserve for your families and your children. I'm telling you the truth. This war is not worthy of you, the Russian people. Putin can and must end this war. The American people will stand with you and the brave citizens of Ukraine who want peace. My message to the rest of Europe, this new battle for freedom has already made a few things crystal clear. First, Europe must end its dependence on Russian fossil fuels, and we, the United States, will help. That's why just yesterday in Brussels, I announced the plan with the President of the European Commission to get Europe through the immediate energy crisis. Over the long term, as a matter of economic security and national security for the survivability of the planet, we all need to move as quickly as possible to clean, renewable energy. And we'll work together to help get that done so that the days of any nation being subject to the whims of a tyrant for its energy needs are over. They must end. They must end. And second, we have to fight the corruption coming from the Kremlin to give the Russian people a fair chance. And finally, most urgently, we maintain absolute unity. We must among the world's democracies. It's not enough to speak with rhetorical flourish of ennobling words of democracy, of freedom, equality, and liberty. All of us, including here in Poland, must do the hard work of democracy each and every day. My country as well. That's why That's why I came to Europe again this week with a clear and determined message for NATO, for the G7, for the European Union, for all freedom-loving nations. We must commit now to be in this fight for the long haul. We must remain unified today and tomorrow and the day after, and for the years and decades to come. It will not be easy. There will be cost, but it's a price we have to pay, because the darkness that drives autocracy is ultimately no match for the flame of liberty that lights the souls of free people everywhere. Time and again, history shows that it's from the darkest moments that the greatest progress follows. And history shows this is the task of our time, the task of this generation. Let's remember the hammer blow that brought down the Berlin Wall. The might that lifted the Iron Curtain were not the words of a single leader. It was the people of Europe who for decades fought to free themselves. Their sheer bravery opened the border between Austria and Hungary for the pan-European picnic. They joined hands for the Baltic Way. They stood for solidarity here in Poland. And together, it was an unmistakable and undeniable force of the people that the Soviet Union could not withstand. And we're seeing it once again today with the brave Ukrainian people showing that their power of many is greater than the will of any one dictator. So in this hour, let the words of Pope John Paul burn as brightly today. Never, ever give up hope. Never doubt. Never tire. Never become discouraged. Be not afraid. A dictator bent on rebuilding an empire will never erase a people's love for liberty. Brutality will never grind down their will to be free. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. God bless you all, and may God defend our freedom, and may God protect our troops. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Warsaw Royal Castle in Poland, with the Polish Prime Minister and Ukrainian Foreign Minister among those in attendance. If you're just joining us now, I'm here in the studio with our reporter, William Glucroft. William, this was framed very much as a battle between democracy and autocracy. I just want to start by getting your first impressions from this speech from Biden.
Well, I just want to quickly begin at the end, where it's always hard because Joe Biden sometimes lets things slip out in half sentences, but he said at the end, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power, is what I heard, which I can only assume is a reference to Vladimir Putin, which that seems like a very strong statement about American policy or Biden's policy towards the future of Putin in power in Russia. I think there's a lot more to unpack in that one, in just that sentence, but there's much more to talk about. It's notable that he started with this sentence, "Be not afraid." Referencing Pope John Paul. Poland is a very deeply Catholic country. They're very proud. There's a lot of pride still of Pope John Paul's becoming the Pope, right?
He brought that up at the beginning and the end.
He brought it in the beginning and the end. He bookended the speech with it, also with a lot of Cold War references, because Pope John Paul was part of this liberation movement, was part of confronting Soviet authoritarianism and trying to bring freedom back to Poland and beyond. And it reminded me of his State of the Union a few weeks ago, where Joe Biden kind of whispered into the microphone, "It will be okay." And I think we're in a very dark moment right now where you have Vladimir Putin hinting about nuclear weapons, not even hinting, quite clearly talking about nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and not just the war, but with climate change. There's a lot of existential threats that seem to be converging right now. And there's understandably a lot of fear. And you're seeing Joe Biden in speeches like this and at the State of the Union trying to play the role of the commander in calming, right? Trying to calm people down, trying to show not just force in a military sense, but force that he has things under control, that the United States, as a leader of the West, as a leader of democracies, has things under control, to try to bring some ease. And I think this "be not afraid" comment that was at the top and the bottom of his speech was very much in that line to try to ease some very understandable anxieties right now.
A call for unity there. I mean, he also said in the speech that NATO is more united now than it has ever been. As you've mentioned, plenty of Cold War references to the Berlin Wall, among other things. But as the Ukrainians, many in attendance for this speech in Poland, they're looking at what he said. What do you think they are going to make of his comments in terms of practical terms in his support?
Well, he said, "We stand with you." I think maybe from Zelensky's point of view, maybe we stand slightly behind you. Zelensky has come out saying he's disappointed in NATO support. He's disappointed in U.S. support, thankful for what there is, what has been given. And Biden went through a list of all the money, all the arms, of all the humanitarian assistance. He went through a long list of what the U.S. and European allies have provided. Ukrainians have made no secret that they don't think it's enough. They've been calling for a no-fly zone. They've been calling, as have some European countries like Poland, calling for a peacekeeping mission under NATO or international command, whatever that might mean. I think international basically means the West at this point.
Let's just clarify, why has Biden been reluctant to do that?
And very reluctantly, because it would almost surely spark a direct confrontation with Russia, as some military analysts and retired military officers have been talking about. Right now, with an active war going on in Ukraine, it's not a peacekeeping mission, it's a peace-enforcing mission. That's a very different mission. And a no-fly zone also means not only attacking Russian planes and downing missiles over Ukrainian airspace, it would mean attacking Russian assets in Russia. Because of course Russia can control airspace from its own territory with long-range missiles and radar installations and that kind of thing. And we should remember, we're currently at this time of year in 1999, NATO began its bombing campaign of former Yugoslavia. To dislodge what, by that point, and in comparison, was a rather decrepit and dying dictatorship of Slobodan Milosevic. And that was a 78-day air campaign. That was not easy. There were losses. It took a long time for NATO to achieve its tactical goals. So we should not underestimate how difficult enforcing a no-fly zone or any kind of more direct military intervention would be. And of course, Russia, for all of its tactical mistakes and surprisingly weak military action, is still much more powerful than Slobodan Milosevic was. So just to kind of put things in perspective there, Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, has said it is our job to support Ukraine, but it is also our job to make sure this doesn't escalate and spiral even further. We are talking about nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And those things are very, very serious that we should take into account. And this has been the obvious reluctance. Just as on the European side, you've had an obvious reluctance to going harder on energy embargoes and sanctions against gas companies and cutting off payments to those kinds of things, because it would presumably very, very, very much harm European economies, put people in mass out of work, and it would really lead to a global crisis.
I want to ask you more about this Cold War vision that we saw in this speech. Biden said the battle for democracy did not end with the Cold War. He has accused Russia of, quote, strangling democracy, and says that it is a state bent on violence and on lies. Those are tough words. Do you think Putin is listening?
I'm sure he's listening. Whether he cares or not is another question. And of course, he'll hear what he wants to hear. I mean, Putin has a track record of poisoning his enemies, of meddling in the elections of his neighbors, of invading some of his neighbors, Georgia in 2008, and of course, Ukraine the first time around in 2014, albeit in a more indirect, kind of covert, secretive way. So Putin has a long history of doing this. And I find the Cold War comparisons interesting. The comparisons are obvious why they're there. I think in a certain way we're actually in more dangerous territory now. In the Cold War, there were two equally matched sides, two ideologies that had self-preservation in mind. There were arms control treaties and arms control in place. There were hotlines in place to keep things from boiling over, to make sure that there were no misunderstandings in terms of military maneuvers and these kinds of things. Most of that infrastructure is gone. So the chances of missteps, misunderstandings is very, very great, especially if we hear from Vladimir Putin's side, almost in some of his addresses, looking for an excuse to escalate, looking for an excuse to do more, as we've been seeing with these arms convoys coming in from Europe into Ukraine to support Ukrainian forces, may be seen as a threat itself, just as one example.
All right, William Glucroft, I want to thank you so much for coming into the studio to help us analyze this speech from Biden in Warsaw. Thank you so much for your time. We're going to turn now to a developing story from Western Ukraine. Officials in Lviv say missile strikes have hit a fuel storage facility, which is now burning after reports of 3 powerful explosions. Lviv is located around 70 kilometers from the Polish border and has been seen as something of a safe haven for those fleeing the Russian invasion of the eastern, northern, and southern parts of Ukraine. After the blasts, you can see